College, and I have the pleasure of chairing the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And before I welcome and introduce this afternoon's illustrious speaker, Professor Wendy Lower, I just want to mention that we have a very important co-sponsor, the Center for Jewish Studies, and I want to thank them. And of course, I want to thank the great staff of the Davis Center, especially Laura Sargent, for making these events possible. This event is the last one in our series for this season. We recently had the pleasure of hearing Leon Kogan speak about Rivka Angel, the fascinating Jewish Russian-American artist. And today we will have the great pleasure of hearing Wendy Lower. I also want to say that, of course, the programming for this season had been finished before Russia invaded Ukraine, before the start of this terrible war. And yet, I think the events of the terrible war that we're all living through, and particularly the Russian atrocities committed in Ukraine, have rendered the subject of today's conversation particularly poignant. And with that in mind, I want to say that Dr. Wendy Lower is one of the leading students of the Shoah in the occupied Soviet territories. She is the John K. Roth Professor of History and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Professor Lower chairs the academic committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and previously served as acting director for the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Lower is the author of a number of books, including Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, The Diary of Samuel Goldfarb and the Holocaust in Galicia, and co-editor with Ray Brandon of Shoah in Ukraine, History, Testimony, Memorialization. Her book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, published back in 2013, was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been translated into 23 languages. Just as a digression, Wendy, perhaps you will appreciate this. I think last year, one of my kids had a unit on the Holocaust in school, and kids were talking about how the Holocaust is cool, which was their way of saying that they really enjoyed the subject. I think if I were to choose one of the coolest books, I would be choosing Hitler's Furies, which I greatly admire and learn so much from. And finally, today's subject, the Ravine, a family, a photograph, a Holocaust massacre revealed, which is the title of Wendy Lower's new book, published in February 2021 by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. This book received the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category and has been shortlisted for the very important prize, the Wingate Prize, and longlisted for a PEN Book Prize. And with that in mind, Wendy, I just want to tell you how happy we are to have you and how much we appreciate your being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise. Welcome.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you so much for this invitation to the Russian Eurasian Center and the Jewish Studies Program Center at Harvard. I am really honored to be giving this talk today. It is the week of Holocaust Remembrance, Yom HaShoah, so the timing is right there. And I want to acknowledge actually all the history of genocide as we know it, that just happens to often take place or begin in April. April seems to be that month. So not only the victims of the Holocaust, but of other genocides, including Armenia and Cambodia and Rwanda. So this is a time of reflection on these kinds of events. And of course, now we're seeing genocide in Ukraine again. And this is, a very powerful moment right now as far as our exhortation to never forget and to never again. And so my thoughts and prayers are with my Ukrainian colleagues, and we're doing all we can to end the suffering as much as we can there, as quickly as we can. So the subject of my talk is the book, The Ravine, and it concerns an atrocity photograph from 1941 that was taken in Ukraine in a small town called Mariupol, not Mariupol, Mariupol. So we're going to be looking at that photograph today, and we're going to be talking about atrocity photography from the war and how to research it. And I would welcome your questions when we look at these photographs about the photographs and any input you might have, further clues that you see in the photograph that can be researched. And also if you're interested in talking about the use of these photographs, whether in the public realm or in the classroom, I would be happy to engage that as well. I mean, we've all seen how one photograph of suffering or violence can move audiences and propel humanitarian action and social justice. Iconic images of atrocities, a naked girl fleeing a napalm attack in Vietnam, a little Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, whose corpse washed up on that Turkish beach. Now, of course, we're seeing these images out of Bucha. What do we do? You know, sometimes these become agents of change, these images, as in the case of Alan Kurdi and the German government and Europeans changing their immigration policy vis-a-vis Syria. But they're also part of our collective memory of particular historical disasters. They're a part of our kind of visual recall of this history. They're widely circulated and displayed, but often with little information about the circumstances or persons pictured in them, and even usually less about the photographer. So as an historian of the Holocaust, and a teacher, I was especially concerned about the lack of research on rare photographs that were used as kind of standard illustrations, but not studied as historical documents. I knew that the most graphic images were the subject of scholarly debates about what should or should not be displayed. But were there rules about what should be studied or how it should be researched? And what were the ethics and methods of that inquiry? I had written books, as Maxime mentioned, that privileged the use of Nazi documentation, for instance, in Hitler's Furies, and another book about a victim's diary, a Jewish man in Przemyślany in Galicia, Western Ukraine, and wondered if visual evidence in a single photograph could open up new lines of inquiry and discovery about the Holocaust. So as I was kind of in my mind thinking about these issues of research and teaching and the visual age we live in and one of our responsibilities, I actually ended up, a photograph came to me at that moment and kind of stopped my research at that moment. I'm going to open up my screen now. Sharing screen, this is the title of the book. This is the cover of the book. These are some examples of the more kind of iconic, familiar photographs that people refer to or use as standard illustrations. They're kind of stand-ins for the Holocaust, right? So the image of Anne Frank, the entrance gates to Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, this man here from Ukraine, the so-called last Jew from Vinica, who actually is probably from Berdichev, being killed by Einsatzgruppen in the summer of 41. Elie Wiesel here in the Buchenwald barracks, of course, this little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto from April 1943 from the Stroop report, and the Einsatzgruppen commando here in southern Ukraine again, shooting this family that's running. And then the corpses, the liberation photos that are part of the American kind of understanding of the Holocaust. This is what you see when you come out of the museum, the exhibit in DC. These are the first images you see, these corpses. This is the photo, just again warn you that it's rather disturbing, that was brought to my attention in August 2009. I was working at the museum, actually researching on something else, a perpetrator in Germany who was still alive. And so again, this photo came to my attention. My colleagues brought it to me and said, what do you think? What do you make of this? And it was, I had a lot to start with. I had a lot to work with from the beginning. Because the photograph had been sitting in an archive in Prague since the 50s. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was findable by these two journalists who were working in Prague and setting up this new institute in Prague on totalitarianism. And so they realized this was such a powerful image, which we're going to walk through together in a moment. And they brought it to DC, traveled that distance to try to find out more about it. And so these two journalists told us that it was taken on October 13th, 1941, in this small town called Mariupol, about 100 miles west of Kiev, so more of central Ukraine, that it was taken by a Slovakian photographer. So that's why it was sitting in this archive in Prague. And then he took more than one, was part of a series. They had up to 7. This one was the most powerful in the way that it was composed and cropped with the family in the center. It was the one that we really focused on as far as trying to reconstruct the history and what happened at this moment. And we also had a protocol of the photographer, a testimony that was taken in 1958. So we had more biographical information about the photographer. So this is what I had as of 2009, these pieces of information to start with. But as I looked at the photograph with my colleagues and I studied it for almost a decade, there were certain elements of this photograph that seemed to pop out at me, again, approaching this in the 21st century, coming out of Holocaust studies. So for instance, the shoes and this kind of echo of the shoes, of the absence of presence, of the individual loss, the distinctiveness of the individuals in their shoes, as they're displayed at the museum in heaps and piles, which also show the magnitude of the Holocaust, either in Washington, D.C. or back at Auschwitz-Birkenau, that this were on the Danube, where the shoes are bronzed. That this has become this very kind of iconic image of the Holocaust and of loss. And the fact that this picture is taken in broad daylight. And the chapter of the Holocaust that we've been spending a lot of time on of late is The Holocaust by Bullets, which is the title of Father Patrick Desbois' book, which turned our attention to the mass murders outside the gassing facilities and the discovery of more mass graves in the former Soviet Union and changing our understanding of the Jewish experience being outside of the killing centers, whereby the perpetrators went to their hometowns as part of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, and with their guns and basically hunted them down in these kinds of so-called security actions and roundups. And it was done rapidly. The expansion was very, very fast in the summer of 41. It started with when the Nazis invaded in June 41 with targeting men, Jewish men, and then within a few weeks, within a month, expanding that to women and children. And when Himmler issued that famous order to and was pushing his men to kill more and then take out entire communities at the end of July, he referred to the Jewesses who should be pushed into the swamps, the Pripyat marshes. And this genocide occurring in what we think of as kind of killing fields, and that compares with other cases of genocide, raises all kinds of questions about environmental history, about bystanders, about the topography of these sites, down to the soil and the composition of the soil and the change in the landscape, and the fact that this is happening in people's hometowns and what happens, over time to these sites as far as local memory. And the Nazis put nature to work. So when you think about environmental history, you think of nature as another component of the human experience, and it actually the changing that occurs, our relationship with nature and what nature does kind of back to us in that way. They use the swamps. Himmler said, drive the women into the rivers. They use the ravines in Ukraine. They use the soil to suffocate the victims. They didn't waste bullets on the children. This is part of that local history. And here we have a very stark depiction in this image of collaboration in the act of murder. The act of murder against local, these were these Ukrainian auxiliaries, these were their Jewish neighbors. The Slovakian photographer in his protocol mentioned that the Ukrainians there who were shooting would refer by name to the victims as they were forced to come to the edge of the pit in their final moments. And there's a gentleman with a cap on, kind of onlooker. And again, we have these witnesses in these communities and those stories that are still in those places. Can we find those individuals and find out more about the victims? And the Germans there, in this particular perspective, this angle, that the photographer, is pointing towards the center. We'll see in a moment another image, a better front view of the Germans, where we can actually look at their uniforms and do the kind of research to find out through the Nazi documents what unit this is. Is it SS? Is it a regular soldier, Wehrmacht unit? what was their training? Who were these individuals? Have they been interrogated? Has there been any justice on the part of the Germans or the West Germans here post-war? And what happened to these Ukrainian auxiliary police who signed up basically when the Germans arrived? They presented themselves as supporters of the regime. Another aspect of this photograph is the smoke in the center, which entailed a little bit of work in the realm of ballistics, and that's not my area of expertise, obviously, but I could make a few phone calls and find out some more and do a little bit more research and reading about it, and learned that this smoke here is actually another clue, another piece of evidence of a massacre, that there were multiple victims. This was not a singular kind of homicide or murder of this family, but that victims before who had been shot and with the guns blasting at the same time simultaneously, creating that cluster of smoke, which then with the next group of victims brought to the pit, and the second blast, kind of execution style, that blows that hole, the heat from the muzzle blast blows that hole through the smoke, and that's why there's that kind of haloing effect, which tells us, that this coat and these shoes could very well have been the person or persons, part of a group of persons who had been killed prior to this group. And the family at the center of this image, this woman, it's hard to see, her face is obscured in the smoke. She's bending over there in her dress, polka dotted dress, and her Mary Jane shoes, and that little boy who's barefooted, and she's clasping his hand. And in fact, with the advent of digital technology, you can zoom in and zoom out and find more details here. And even this child who's kind of slipping from her lap there, you can see the contours there of another victim that she's trying to shelter. Around the shoes, again, with this ability to zoom in, we find these bullet casings, and here around this is a kind of litter of mass murder that's part of this image of the shoes. I don't know if that's cloth or lists potential information about the victims, identity documents. This is the protocol that was taken. Our Lubomir Skrovina was the name of the photographer, and you can see here he's born in 1916. This interrogation is from 1958. This is really important piece of evidence, because the photographer tells us, recounts what happened that day, that he heard the smoke, or sorry, he heard the screams. He could hear the commotion, and he went to check it out. His commander said to him, "Go see what's happening." Lubomir was the company's scribe, the Slovakian unit. And think about it, a Slovakian in uniform, also part of this Nazi invasion. The Axis forces, of course, Hungarian, Romanian, Slovakian, and even Spanish expeditionary forces in this monumental campaign, as it was viewed at the time, to defeat Judeo-Bolshevism. And so we have collaboration also in the form of, for the victims, right, who, if they even noticed this photographer, yet another person, another uniform on the scene, in this case, a Slovakian one. And the proximity of that photo, the vividness of it, the fact that we see here in this protocol, our photographer tells us about his camera, the actual model, the size icon, and how many pictures of the film that he used, and how many pictures, prints he had, and negatives, which turned out to be very, very significant, because the photographer who went there with his camera to check it out, who was the company scribe and was officially allowed to kind of document the history of their unit's actions, taking these pictures openly, further humiliating the victims, was actually, I discovered, taking them as an act of resistance. And that camera, knowing the model of that camera and how many he could take, and then looking at the series, was his visual testimony, was his attempt to show us, and ultimately the Jews in Slovakia as well, because he went back to Slovakia and showed these pictures to warn them, do not go east when you're called up for deportations, but to show step by step in sequence, through a kind of visual testimony of resistance, what was happening to Jews in the Eastern territories. This is another image from the series. You can, I don't have all the images here. You can look in the book, but showing the Jews being marched to this killing site. A few pictures of the actual killing of the women and children, and then a picture at the end that Lubomir took as he stood over kind of the pits, looking down into the pit. But this is another angle, front view of the soldiers, the German soldier, and in this moment, I could better identify the unit, and that it was not, and rule out that it was not SS and police. It was not Order Police. Order Police Battalion 303 was involved in massacres in Mariupol, but the Order Police uniform has different buttons, more buttons above the belt, and black cuffs, and different collar, and different cap. So in my search for the perpetrators, and maybe to kind of affect some sort of justice, and actually if we're still alive, I determined that they were ultimately, that they were not trained to do this. They were an all volunteer killing unit, and they came from a customs unit. They were in Mariupol to check packages at their local railway station. This was not what they were trained to do. They were part of the finance ministry. They had nothing to do with Himmler's agencies or the regular Wehrmacht, the German army. And so it, according to West German testimony, because these killers ended up in West Germany after the war, they actually were in, it's horrifically fascinating, actually. They were playing cards the night before this massacre. It was October 12th. There were about 300 Jews left in Mariupol at this time. In the fall of 41, the Germans had already done this kind of initial sweep through there on their way to Babi Yar. And then some of the units came back for kind of so-called mopping up operations. And they came into the town and they said to these other German officials, how come there are Jews still here? These 300 Jews. There were about 960 Jews in Mariupol altogether when the Nazis arrived. And these customs guards stood up, said, "Jawohl, I will volunteer to participate in this action." The following day, that started the following day. This is the photographer, Lubomir Skrovina, taken about the time he was interrogated in the 50s, and his camera, again, that he mentioned in his camera, the model, and there it is. It's remarkable that I was able to track down the camera, because it turned out that when he died, he was born in 1916 and he died in 2005. He donated the camera to the Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava, and specifically asked that they display it in a exhibit on the Holocaust. And in this donation letter mentioned that collaboration should be a theme in that exhibit, because he had documented it with that picture that we've been studying. So Skrovina ended up going back to his hometown. Here he was in Mariupol in September 41, about a month before he took that picture with his comrades. He's right there in the middle. It's pretty striking that we have a photograph of him in the same location a month before. But he's writing letters back to his wife and saying, this is not the war I signed up for. In fact, he was anti-war, didn't want to put on a uniform. He was 25 years old at the time, and said, like his hair was turning gray and his mind was turning black. He couldn't witness these atrocities anymore. And so went back home for Christmas with his camera, and with his negatives, his rolls of film, and with his wife, they embarked on kind of a rescue of Jews. Subsequently, they brought a OBGYN, a Jewish doctor, and his family. At least two families came through their hiding in their house in their attic, and the one doctor actually delivered Lubomir's son, Lubomir Jr., in 1943. And then he was bringing these families and equipment and supplies to the forests outside of the town. Banska Bystrica was the center of Slovakian resistance. And then Nazis eventually came in 44 and wiped out a lot of those partisan camps, and did kill some of the Jews he had actually tried to rescue. But at least one gentleman, the Dr. Gotthilf, actually survived. So the issue of the camera is really important in this history. The Holocaust is the most well documented as far as archivally documented genocides on record, and also the most kind of the visual record of this genocide is also extensive, because at this moment we have the introduction of the pocket camera, which was patented alike in the 1920s and then hit the consumer market in the 1930s. And Goebbels, was wanted to film this Nazi triumph as they viewed it over Europe, and the beginning of their establishment of the Lebensraum and their whole realization of their devious genocidal operations. And so Goebbels actually embedded something like 15,000 photojournalists, and their propaganda units produced more than 3.5 million images, as well as the images we have from ordinary soldiers and photo albums. And it was encouraged by the regime. This is an advertisement. This is the optical Panzer, promoting the camera as being, resistant to warfare and shrapnel. And here this soldier has it, around his neck. We see the postcard, so with the Red Cross stamp on it and the care package. And so the camera is part of kind of what's in the soldier's knapsack, part of the soldier's experience. But with the care package there in the postcard, you can also see that the camera is being promoted as a way. Here it says photos are a bridge between the home front and the battlefront. And, so the soldier doesn't have to feel so removed from home, but it goes both ways, right? It's the soldier's experience that he's capturing, that he's going to share with his loved ones. And again, in a kind of triumphant mode of being self-aware of being in the moment of making this history. But part of this history is the Holocaust. And so is when the massacres begin in the summer of 41, the mass shootings, so do the orders start to come out of central headquarters. Don't take photos of the atrocities, and trying to distinguish between, photos of the war, of victory, of the soldier's experience, but not of these crimes behind the lines, because the fear was that was going to foment resistance. They didn't want these photographs in circulation. And in fact, that's what it did, because I just told you about a photographer who took these pictures and then used them to stoke more resistance back in Slovakia. The site of the actual massacre, Miropol, right? This is a map from the 17th century of Jewish life in Ukraine. Just to emphasize here, Miropol is here in the center. First of all, it's interesting that this town, which is, really kind of out of the way place now, it's not on the main road from Lviv to Kiev that passes over Zhytomyr, for instance. So it's one of these remote communities today, but in the 17th century here, it's kind of central on the map, and also just even the kind of prominence of this in relationship to these other communities that are much larger now, like Zhytomyr and like major cities. So it indicates, the importance of these all these different shtetls, as we would call them, and the importance of the Jewish migration to Ukraine historically, whether it was, invited by the Polish lords during the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom. At this time, this is before Russians, the partition of Poland, the kind of Russification and the establishment of the Pale of Settlement. But this is basically the heart of the Pale of Settlement and of Jewish civilization in Ukraine. And this is it today. This is when I went back, well, not exactly today, because I have not been checking on the fate of this town as far as Russian shelling. But this is what Miropol looked like in 2014, and then when I went back in 2016. And I was just struck by, as I stood there in the marketplace, this is the same marketplace where the Jews were gathered the night before that massacre, so on October 12th. And they were subjected to a pogrom the night before, kept awake all, and humiliated, and the testimony of the women, for instance, who were part of that scene in the marketplace, and the sexual violence that was also documented and witnessed. And so this was a site historically of interaction, of commerce, of exchange, of kind of a vibrant economic, socioeconomic life there. But these vacancies are striking. You know, these were shops, these were prayer houses, these were the Jewish community had a hospital and established tailors and carpenters, and this is the kind of the loss of this is with kind of aftermath of genocide, but also a century in terms of Ukraine, 20th century of the First World War, of the pogroms that followed the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalinism, the Holodomor in the early 30s, the purges of terror, and then the Nazi onslaught and the Holocaust that accompanied that, and then the renewed, Soviet return and occupation until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Ukraine got its independence, only to kind of come out of that in a decade struggle of hyperinflation, and now the war since 2014, and now directly in these parts of Ukraine as of a few months ago. So the Jews were forced to march from here was the marketplace, that scene, and down through here, down this road. And we know this path that they took past this police station where Jews were forced detained here. The Ukrainians were dancing around singing the death march, the funeral march with the Germans, the flow of alcohol, the entire scene that I described that caught the attention of Lubomir, that was heard by the local community of peasants and townsfolk. So this kind of open air massacre on that day. And this is the trail here, the path that they were forced to take. So why do I have this incredible document as this detailed drawing in color of the path that the Jews were forced to take? Here's the central marketplace, and here's the arrow leading to this scene in the woods. What was formerly the Polish estate up on the hill overlooking the Sluch River was the location that the Germans chose. This is a drawing from a prosecutor's office, part of a trial, an investigation that took place in Soviet Ukraine, starting in 1985 and concluding in January 1987. So a very late period of kind of renewed justice in the Gorbachev era. And this particular prosecutor, Makarevich, from Zhytomyr, who was in charge of the entire district, the oblast, was going to pursue one more wave and one more search for possible Ukrainian collaborators, traitors to the homeland, and actually found the 3 Ukrainians in the photograph, which is really remarkable. One of them was actually still living in the town. And so these Ukrainians were apprehended and brought back and made to reenact and recount in detail what happened that day. And that's the basis of these drawings. And here's the arrest report of one of them. And when you compare this man's face with the photos from Skrovina, one can see the likeness, one can see the match. But the photograph that's the subject of my research was not out of the archives yet, right? So this pursuit of justice, whether it was the Soviet Ukrainians or it was the West Germans, was done, or Slovakians, was done without this photograph. It was not available, certainly not after the 1950s. The Ukrainians who were apprehended were convicted, the 3 of them. 2 of them were executed by firing squad in January 87, and one was actually a youth during the war. He was 17 years old, so he got 15 years in jail, was sent into the Soviet Russian prison system, interior Russia, and has never been heard from again. But that was 1987, and Ukraine, was established its independence in 1991. When I went back to Mariupol, I could not find any information about his fate, this 3rd defendant, and it's still a mystery. Presumably he died in prison. This is the West German police report, which I include in the book, and I found it really interesting because of capture the kind of climate of West German pursuit of justice and the kind of attitude and the, in many ways, the lack of political wills, and the outcome of this is a pretty thin file in the end. So it's kind of representative of that history. And, you know, bizarrely, one of the former members of that customs unit, Mr. Hoffman here, who's now a retired vet of the war, he walked into this police station in a small town called Lotzen near Hanover in 1969, in January 1969, and basically said, I want to report a crime. So this is decades later. And on this German intake form, it just says that it was the Tatort, the crime scene was Mirapol, but misplaces it in Russia, that it was the date of the crime was 1941, that was mass murder during the Nazi period, that the victims were Jewish and Russian people who are unknown. And then he goes on to talk about those two killers in the picture, Kusk and Voigt, and what happened that day, the Scott game, and how after the shooting, they came back to the barracks and they were bragging about it and reenacting how they doled out bullets against the local Jews. But the case was not, the testimony was collected. One could, you know, I had the advantage of comparing the testimony with the photograph and actually being able to analyze and see where the perjury took place and where the obfuscation took place, and put their statements kind of to the test of the photograph. And indeed, there was a lot of lying and denial. My last real pursuit of in researching this photograph, and for me, what was really important because of the nature of the photograph, which is almost pornographic in the way that the women is bending over and all the men are in this gang formation firing at her. And the fact that this family that is in the center of this image. And what does that mean, the family in the history of genocide? History of genocide, when we talk about root and branch, which was what the Nazi version was a kind of biological total eradication. Root and branch obviously has that kind of genealogical, inherently genealogical meaning to it. And looking at the literature on the role of the procreative force of the family and what that means to genocide heirs. Hitler, turns out in the summer of 41, as I went back to some of the classic kind of documentation on his speeches and the decision making leading up to the final solution, and a meeting he had with Kvaternik, his Croatian ally, turns out he starts to talk about the family, the Jewish family, that no family should be left on the continent of Europe. This is July 41. So that assertion made in the context of the Himmler expanding the mass murder to entire Jewish communities and going after the family. Hitler argued that historically, the Jewish question had not been solved forever because the offspring of Jews or the family members would rise up and avenge the sufferings of their loved ones. And this was a cycle he saw of Jewish return that he wanted to stop. So part of this research was the attempt to restore the family in that picture and their dignity as far as their identities and their names and their histories, to try to work against what was in fact this negation of the family in the Nazi genocide, Jewish family. And what did I have? Well, about 960 Jews were killed in Mirapol, as I mentioned. And when the Red Army returned in 44, they put together these lists as part of their Soviet Extraordinary Commission as much as possible. And the names amounted to about half the victims. And that's because, you know, as much as we have succeeded in different institutions in identifying, you know, trying to identify the 6 million, especially Yad Vashem, there are so many more that are missing. 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust were murdered on the terrain, in the terrain, or were resided in what is Ukraine's borders today. And half of those have not been identified, mostly the children, because of the rapid nature of the assault. There's nobody being registered and put on trains as laborers. It's just the perpetrators going to those localities and quickly killing them and not bothering, maybe roughly coming up with a number of the population, but not identifying those victims or listing them by name. So these lists are basically all I had to go from. And the fact that that boy in the center looked like he was toddler, he could be 4 or 5 years old. And so looking at the surnames here and trying to find family units that had little boy with that, about that age, and then going through all the Yad Vashem intake forms, their testimonies, pages of testimony, and A to Z for this town of Mirapol, and trying to find out more about the Jewish families who were killed there in the fall of 41. And it turned out that a survivor, a woman who had been evacuated in 41 and then returned with her family to her hometown of Mirapol, and was given this photograph that was all that remained of her family, her aunt and her cousins, her aunts and her cousins, the Sandler family, the Vasiliuk family, Hiva here to the right. And this survivor went back in 2000, Svetlana Budnitskaya, to Yad Vashem and filled out this form. She had emigrated from the Soviet Union to the Midwest and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and was honoring them by filling this out, that her aunt, this nurse here up in the corner, was killed in the park with her children, with these children, her cousins. And this boy here was just so striking. The likeness of this little boy in this suit just so reminded me of the little boy in the picture, and that maybe this woman here could be the same woman who's kind of in that bending over in that pose, and this could be the child on her lap. But I could not say for certain, and I didn't want to misidentify them. But I was able to bring the photo back to Ukraine with me, with the Yahad and Unam team. I wanted to see how Father Desbois' work occurred kind of in the field with this case, my case kind of the massacre in Mirapol, and gave them all the documentation I had. And then we went around and interviewed local eyewitnesses, people who worked with the Jews in the local paper factory, who knew them from town, from interactions in town. And they started to give us more names of more Jewish families who weren't on those lists. But I could not actually say with certainty that was the Vasiliuk Sandler family was the one in the atrocity photo that I was researching. Here are some witnesses, including this boy at the time, an elderly man now, who was crouching kind of in the fields and watching what was happening from a distance, and telling us his memory, his very vivid memory of that day. This woman was living above the marketplace and observing what was happening that night, through the night. And then we decided to take a walk to the actual crime scene and retrace the steps of the Jewish victims that day. And we had that document with the path, with the arrow from the Soviet prosecutor. And we walked closer into that area that was the former gardens of the estate of the Polish lord in the 17th century, and had our cameras with us, and went into that in that forest, and immediately saw this terrain that was so unusual. I mean, there were craters and mounds, and the vegetation was off, wasn't uniform. And it looked like a kind of a moonscape in a way, but with the vegetation, with the leaves there. And then we just reached down and just removed some of the dirt, and immediately came upon human remains, bones, vertebrae, and skull fragments, and realized that we were standing at the site, at the mass grave, on top of it, the one that's pictured in the photograph, where that family was buried. And because the Soviets in the 80s, as they pursued this, they needed the victims' remains in order to carry out the trial, and they went in there in a very rough manner with this exhumation with these large trucks and tractors, and completely kind of participated in another assault against these souls in this site. And of course, we immediately called the chief rabbi in Europe, in Strasbourg, to plead with him as far as like giving him the coordinates to make sure that this site could be protected in the future. I'd like to now wrap up with this element of the photograph here with the shoes, to give us a chance to kind of reflect a little bit, especially on this day, Yom HaShoah, about the power of this image and what this means to us when we think about those who remain missing. These shoes, that empty shoes and crumpled coat that exist in this photo as questions, as gaps in knowledge, that remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remain missing. Now, prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, in literature and photography as symbols of humanity. And the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums. As historical sources of material culture, shoes have come to aestheticize absence and mourning on a large scale. In the Ravine, in the epilogue, I quote stanzas, I include stanzas from the Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever. I was really struck by his poem, A Load of Shoes, that he wrote in January 1943, when he discovered, as he was in the Vilna ghetto, sorting through the belongings of Jews who had been deported to Ponari, he discovered his deported mother's shoes. They were in the Vilna ghetto together, and wrote this poem in response to that. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride. Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, in with the others. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers, unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead us because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image and turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of the victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. The papers strewn amid the bullet casings at the edge of the mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to the acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance, and when we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you.
Wendy, thank you so very much for this really moving talk, which also raised very important ethical questions, methodological questions about research, and really questions that are still riddled with many unresolved and perhaps unresolvable situations. And I'm sure we have questions and comments. I just want to start by reading comments from our colleague Jack Porter, who's done very important work on the Jewish partisans in the occupied territories, who says, "Thank you, Wendy. My two sisters and 25 other family members were killed by similar collaborators in Maniewicz, northern Volhynia, near Kovel." And Jack also says as a comment, but I suppose also as a question, the Ukrainians knew the victims. That was a shot, and that they also shot at close range. So perhaps we could begin by asking you to probe this a little bit further. The familiarity, a certain intimacy, neighborly relations with the victims, and what you could add to that.
Yeah, and it reminds us of course, that very powerful book by Jan Gross, Neighbors. So this is not a, Ukrainian phenomenon, and that collaboration, as we've learned in the past decades, post-Soviet research on the Holocaust opened us, gave us access to these regional archives. Like when I went to Zhytomyr for the first time in 1992, where we could get on the ground level and see how these auxiliary police forces were organized, and their participation, the extent and the depth of their participation. Of course, because it was, we knew about the Travniki men in the case of Ukraine and their presence in the gassing centers there. We knew they were mobilized into these auxiliary police units, but it wasn't really clear how much they were involved in the direct killing. And this image, is that act of murder, which makes it, and it's rare. I mean, I mentioned the archive of photography that's so vast, but actually there are very few that show the act of murder itself. Most of these images, the ones I showed you, the two I showed you were among the rare ones that actually show the act of murder. And very rarely do they show Ukrainians participating in that, armed, side by side with the Germans. So yeah, that is really startling, the intimacy of that, their knowledge of the Jewish community, adding another layer of kind of humiliation to the victims, and that sense of betrayal on the part of their neighbors that shocked the Ukrainians, that put them in the Jewish victims. And this is part of a history of this time, very specific moment of Ukrainians aligning themselves with the Germans, to expel the Soviets, right? I mean, this is kind of in reaction to what could ordinary Europeans do at that moment? And it reminds me today, as far as having to kind of choose, like, what kind of system, you want freedom, or, what is communism, the age of extremes, or fascism? And the Ukrainians, and we saw in the First World War as well, in their struggle for independence, had to rely on a kind of greater power to be that, a patron, as it were, to help them secure that, vis-a-vis the Russians, the more historically dominant Russian and then Soviet presence there. So this is part of, an imperial kind of struggle over this terrain, this breadbasket of Ukraine, and the local Ukrainians who decided to join forces with the Nazis in order to crush the Soviet, remove the Soviets. But they conflated the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, with the Jews. It was called Judeo-Bolshevism, was the term at the time, that was heavily propagated by the Nazis when they arrived, who presented themselves as liberators. And this was, enticing to those local Ukrainians who aligned them, were part of the nationalist movement, or just part of local militia who saw this as an opportunity to enrich themselves, to empower themselves, to climb the ladder of social mobility and ingratiate themselves. So there's a very important history of collaboration, European-wise, as well as the various motivations that drove that, and the extreme violence that resulted.
Yes, thank you. And then one more question from Jack, and then we'll turn to other questions, and perhaps I could also probe a couple of other questions. So Jack Porter is asking about memorialization, because you mentioned, and this is truly fascinating, how you were following the path of the execution to that estate of a Polish nobleman, the park, and then basically the landscape looked a little different. And you spoke very powerfully of this. This also, incidentally, reminded me a little bit of the work of Luba Jorgensen in the Sorbonne, who writes of how the landscape remembers things that the people forget. And I think it's so true in this case. But basically, so you take off the leaves and the topsoil and you see vertebrae. Obviously, there is no memorialization there. There's no marker, right? As if I understand correctly, there's no sign. And this was only what, 10 years ago, Wendy, when you were there?
Last time I was there was 2016. So
when you first discovered it. So in other words,
when I discovered the bones, it was like 6 years ago this summer.
So was there any memorialization in Mirapol?
Yes, there. Well, you had that monument that was in the marketplace with the champagne bottle there. That was actually to the Great Patriotic War there, and with obviously, universalization of that experience of all peaceful Soviet citizens. And then in conjunction with this investigation, which was prompted by a couple of different, forces, as it were, internally within the Soviet Union, there was a kind of thaw and an attempt at justice at that point. Also, Jews from abroad who came back from Canada and Israel and wanted to know what was going on with the fate of their loved ones, and that interaction with the local mayor was also an impetus for this. And so when they brought those bones out in that exhumation, they were able to put together, try to reconstruct the remains into the actual victims, the children. They even identified the head of the Jewish community because he had a disability, and they found that in their, the evidence of that in the skeleton. And they brought those bodies back and reburied them in coffins overlooking the river. And so today there is a small monument closer to town that marks the. It's not a Holocaust memorial though, because it doesn't. It's not specific. Again, it's still kind of conforming to the Soviet ideology of memorialization of the Second World War. But we know from the investigative files exactly who's buried there.
This reminds me a little bit of this insane day I once spent outside of Yalta looking for a marker memorializing one anti-tank ditch where a group of Jews were executed and thrown into. And basically, I spent 3 hours driving around these mountain roads and coming upon what I knew was the place I was looking for, and it was a Soviet monument. And on the third try, I realized that on the actual back of the Soviet monument that universalized the Jewish victims was added language specifically, including in Hebrew, memorializing the Jews killed there. So the first 2 times I went by it because I saw a Soviet monument with a red star, and I just knew that it was not what I was looking for, imagine. So finally, I just thought to look on the other side.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I went, I couldn't find the site. You'll read in the book. And the Ukrainians, every time I go to Ukraine, I was going regularly since 1992, always had the most hospitable kind of open welcome and sharing of information on the part of the Ukrainians. It's doing research there and conducting the interviews. I mean, it's classic hospitality, but people wanting to work with me to get to the truth of what happened and being very candid. I mean, sometimes in interviews, there was still residual anti-Semitism. They were talking about Jews in certain ways. But I appreciated their honesty and the memories that they did share and what they saw, often very traumatic memories, because the young women, the peasant girls, were requisitioned by the Germans, including a woman I interviewed who dug that pit in the picture. That was dug in the park. There was another massacre that occurred in the ravine in town in the winter of January 42, when they couldn't do the digging. They used the whole of the ravine to serve as a mass grave, as it were, because the ground was so hard in January 42 when they killed the remaining Jews, who were the specialists, they called them. But the local community, even though that grave was not marked, that it was the latter one that had the Jewish victims buried there, the local Ukrainians, they brought me there. Like, they knew that was where the Jews in their town, had been memorialized. So it's just an interesting example of that local knowledge, which sadly, we can't. That too will disappear over time. So
yeah. So before I turn to the next question, I'm sure, Wendy, you know this, but I think perhaps it's worth mentioning that I think, I hope I'm not mistaken, but Miropol actually has a very prominent place in Jewish culture.
Yes, I forgot to mention that.
Yes. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, because I was just, I'm not going off of a script here, but it's one of the things I usually talk about, and it's in the book, which is Ansky.
Of course.
That wonderful ethnographer, photographer, kind of trying to capture the vanishing shtetl, going there pre-World War I, and even going back during this First World War, is an amazing source. And that story, the Dybbuk, I don't know, maybe you want to talk about that?
Well, basically, very briefly, because I really want to probe what you know rather than what is commonly known, but Ansky was in Miropol when he was collecting research, particularly, of course, this is the heartland of Hasidism, and in the Dybbuk, which he writes first, in Russian, and then it has a Yiddish life and a Hebrew life. But there is the Rabbi Azriel of Miropol, who is a revered tzaddik who appears at a very crucial place. So Miropol actually figures in the text of the play. And so when the play premiered in Moscow, right, the audiences heard this word, even though the play was spoken in Hebrew, but they could make out Mirapur because that's, still Mirapur. But in any case, so it's particularly interesting that this is a coordinate, not just on the map of Jewish death, but on the map of Jewish memory and culture.
And culture. And
Yeah.
is that play, is that something that's kind of continually to be kind of staged, right? I mean, it's
yes, absolutely. Oh, it's a staple of the Jewish repertoire, and also it's still performed widely at American repertory theaters here today. But in any case, so we have a very interesting question by our colleague Chris Martin here at the Davis Center, who writes, photography today is so much more ubiquitous given cell phones. Photos themselves are available immediately and can be shared quickly through media and social media. They can also be manipulated now given technical wizardry. I am hoping you could comment or consider if the nature of photography as a means for communicating current or historical events has lost or increased in value between the time of the Holocaust and today.
Those are super questions, and
yeah,
and they're questions that we've been debating because in some ways we don't really have the answer. We know that, for instance, we're seeing prime example right now coming out of Ukraine, right? Immediate drone footage, iPhone footage, and similarly we saw this, in Syria. So yeah, we can't pretend, not to know. Or we're confronted with these images, which are such powerful evidence. We become kind of world spectators of these atrocities, and it has an effect. Now, some would argue, like Susan Sontag, it would have a kind of numbing effect. Some would argue, Susan Crane, don't look at them. You're further humiliating the victims by kind of looking at that and subjecting them to a kind of another form of denigration. And then, others would argue, like Sharon Slavinsky's work, Human Rights in Camera, that we are part of this world of witnessing, that it is, in viewing it, we become more empathetic. It's part of our human rights consciousness, which is not kind of innate. It's not, naturally there. It's part of our education. It's part of our socialization. And so, what's the affect of these photos, and what is the potential change that can come from them? And I see them as powerful agents. And I think that they're important for evidence, the pursuit of justice. I think they're become part of our subconscious, whether, that's traumatic or not. It's there. We can see what we're capable of. And of course, the whole book argues that not only do we have to look at them, we have to look at them very closely. That not only takes what Germans say kind of Sitzfleisch, that kind of tenacity, but because, like it or not, we live in a visual world, and they're going to be out there and they're going to be in circulation. Some of these things are going to be commercialized. The last Jew in Vinica, that photo I showed you, an anti-Zionist organization put that on coffee mugs and T-shirts. So they're going to be used in that way. They're going to be used, for instance, as they are, in propaganda machinery in Russia today. I mean, I hesitate now to go out on the road with this because of all this language of in the Russian regime of denazification and Ukrainian collaborators, and inextricably kind of cementing that into our consciousness that maybe that Ukrainians are always collaborators and they're always anti-Semites, and Jewish survivors will say the Ukrainians were the worst. But let me be very clear. This is an image from 1941, a very particular historical moment for Ukraine. It is not 1991 and it is not 2022. And a lot has happened in Ukraine over the decades. And I have to stress, as I was on the phone yesterday, or Monday morning rather, with my colleagues at the Babin Yar Memorial, it's a completely new generation of scholars, educators, and memorial activists who take this history very seriously. Unlike their Polish and Hungarian neighbors, are confronting their history of anti-Semitism and owning up to it, and trying to restore, what was the history of Jews in Ukraine, what was lost, in a dignified, sensitive manner. And I have been very impressed with that movement, and mostly young people who would come to the Holocaust Museum and try to figure out how to do this and what's going on and do the research. The last thing I want to mention, given the current events, is that we also were able at the museum to secure from Ukrainian entrepreneurs here in America, successful ones, funding to create this community of scholars and to foster this exchange. And this has been going on for a while now. And it, was starting to kind of bear fruit as far as civil society there, and intellectual discourse and critical discourse. And, and so this is the tragedy of what's happening now as far as an entire generation of emerging Holocaust scholars and educators and memorial activists who are unable to do their work, and the materials themselves. So their lives are in jeopardy, and the archives that are being destroyed right now. And thank goodness the Holocaust Museum went in with this funding and did this quickly before, basically since 2014, knowing that this war might spread, and being smart about it. And they digitized something like 25 regional archives in Ukraine. And the last tranche of material coming from, perhaps Nikolaev, I'm not sure, but in a danger zone, as it were, was delivered. The hard drives were brought by car to the Romanian border, and by a man who couldn't leave the country, but handed over this material, understood the value of this material. So we have the digital records, kind of the Holocaust archive, as much as possible. It could be reproduced now in DC. And we, of course, can't be sure that that material is going to survive this war, the actual original documentation.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. I really appreciated your comments. And I just want to add also that I think the reason there is so much support for Ukraine in the ex-Soviet Jewish community in North America and in Israel is not just solidarity and principle and opposition to Putin and totalitarianism. It's also because so many of us have family members who were killed in the very places you described. I have family on both my paternal grandfathers and maternal grandmother who were killed in Kamenets-Podolsk, in the Vinnytsia area, and I know who they are. I have their photographs. And it's precisely for that reason that it's important to say that was in 1941, 42, and this is a different world. And in this world, I think I feel much more solidarity with Ukraine, also because it's the land where my family members and their bones lie, and it's under attack now. So I thank you so much, Wendy, for what you said. But just to, if I may, to probe a couple of questions, because we don't have a lot of time left. You spoke about something very challenging, I still think understudied, which is the question of the surviving collaborators and family members of collaborators who perhaps are still alive, but certainly 10, 15 years ago, or in the Soviet Union where I was growing up, or living in the places. I can tell you, for instance, when I was researching the killings of Jews and Krimchaks, Crimean Rabbinite Jews in Eastern Crimea, in the Kerch area, and then in Simferopol, I came upon tremendously disturbing material, which unfortunately I didn't finish researching because I stopped going to Crimea after the annexation, that basically there were family members living in the communities who were known to have participated directly or indirectly, including families who had children in mixed marriages and who surrendered their Jewish grandnieces or nephews, for instance. And neighbors knew that they did that. And I think that was as far as the Soviet third wave of investigation that you described was prepared to go. Because I think this would have opened such wounds in the community. And I just wonder if you could talk about that, because, of course, the whole problem is that 50, 70 years hence, elderly people have different testimonies, and then their family members have different testimonies about them and what to make of that.
And there's so many elements to that reality you just described. The family unit as a theme in the book, and as I was thinking it through, although I didn't fulfill that entirely, what is a trajectory that, applies to all participants. And Levinas talks about in these traumatic events, that kind of trajectory of experience that comes out in those moments of all participants. And when I went back to, including the descendants of the German killers, and when I went back to Mirapol and was interviewing these with the Hadden Unum's team, the witnesses, the Ukrainian local witnesses, we were really struck. It's in the book. One of the women during the interview, and her mother had worked as a maid in a Jewish household, and she had all these childhood memories of getting cakes and things at Passover, and just having that childhood friend, that Jewish friend, and everything. And so she was nostalgic about that, and then she kind of switched and said, one of the members of the Ukrainian police, who was really a sadist and known in town, and kind of terrorizing the community. She stood up and pointed and said, he lived over there, just across the field over her window. This man, continued to threaten the community into the post-war period. So he's an example of that kind of, violence and sadism where there's continuity. It's not, the change of regime changed his behavior, which is interesting. And ultimately, it's unbelievable, but his son, the son of this policeman, ended up killing his own father. I mean, because this man was also brutalizing his mother. I mean, he was domestic abuse. It was just the way he was, And so we ended up going over to that house, by the way. It was abandoned and kind of been turned into, kind of a drug hangout. There were hypodermic needles and everything on the ground. And I talk about it in the book, but, we peeked in the window of that house, and there was oddly quite a bit of items left there, and, china and furniture, it had just been abandoned. But, we wondered, if these were potentially former Jewish belongings that this policeman had, stolen and plundered and looted during the pogrom, for instance. So, but the way it extended out into this Ukrainian family and into that local community, and everybody knew, I think these are some of the stories too that also need to be, told, and have not really been researched systematically in this field.
Yeah. So we have a comment from Deborah Berkowitz, not a question, but a huge thank you for this significant seminar and incredible contribution to Holocaust history. And really, Wendy, this has been such a great talk. I just want to ask you, perhaps in closing, to talk a little more about something that you mentioned, and I still think there is so little general knowledge, and even in the Holocaust studies community, of this sort of this late Soviet push for new justice in the 1980s. For instance, I've done work on Lev Ginsburg, I'm sure you know, the great translator from German, who was also unofficially an investigator of Nazi crimes and enjoyed tremendous privileges traveling in the FRG. And he writes in his posthumous book, And Only My Heart Was Broken, which is a line from Heine, of going to Liepaja, Libavli, where his family was from, and basically meeting a local Jew who recognized a collaborator in the late 1970s and basically ran after this woman and was pushing for justice. But of course, this justice was one that the local authorities were reluctant to pursue. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this effort. You were talking about the Zhytomyr provincial prosecutor, right, and his office. Like, where was that coming from, that push?
Yeah, I feel like it was just coming from all different places because it could. I mean, because there was this kind of thaw politically, and there were these cracks as far as East and West comparisons, and the Fedorenko case and extraditions. And so the OSI itself was really starting to get its program together, Demyanyuk, that case, and his, in Israel, and then the return. And so, as far as American kind of Russian interaction on this, and maybe even collaboration on that, it's an interesting moment at that level. And even in the mass media, I referenced in my book these films that were broadcast, made in Russia, but actually in English and broadcast in America, where they were comparing their approach to the American approach. And that, we were harboring war criminals in America, and there were those accusations. It was like a kind of a competition, and also a way of calling out the different systems as far as their record of justice or lack thereof. So there was that piece of it as well. And that some of these Jewish family members, these were people who had left before the Second World War, even before that, the turn of the century, and left behind, their loved ones, the Rappaport family, for instance. And they came back from Canada and Israel because they could travel and see and get access, and were, and didn't fear kind of Soviet anti-Semitism at that point, to see, to go to a small town like this. And then talk to the mayor and say, well, wait a minute, you've got all these memorials to the victims of the Great War, and what about the Jews in your community? And I think even one of the Rappaport, Mr. Rappaport, he was very, according to the mayor, he went there and he had a couple of things that he wanted to engage with, but ultimately he was trying to honor his family. But he said, we could do business together, right? So there was this moment where he could say, let's revive the paper factory. This is going to be a new era, maybe capitalismus, maybe there can be some of that business opportunity, and help with the memorial effort in the end, and then ultimately with the trial, to witness the trial and participate in that. So there were, various motives for this, and it was a moment where these opportunities, where these possibilities opened up. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, they didn't really predict that, obviously, but that's part of these fissures and these movements that could come together at that moment. So,
yeah, that's great. Thank you again, Professor Lower. I just want to thank you for your tremendous presentation, for your openness to these questions, and for the wonderful work you're doing. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us.
Take care.